In the fall of 1940, Hitler visited Germany's primary naval base at Kiel. Though he had always favored the army over the navy, his priorities shifted after Germany's occupation of France. With Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain moving forward, Hitler suddenly took an interest in large-scale landing craft production. At the same time, he became unexpectedly focused on a place he'd rarely mentioned before, Singapore. He demanded Japan coordinate its actions, insisting that when German forces launched their attack on Britain, Japan must simultaneously strike British territories in Southeast Asia. This played right into Japan's hands, as seizing Singapore was already a key objective in their southern expansion strategy. Japan had long sought to eliminate British influence from China entirely, and after Britain declared war on Germany, Tokyo ordered all British citizens in China to leave immediately, forcing them to pack up and return home. Meanwhile, in Britain, Chamberlain's appeasement government had fallen, replaced by the hardline Winston Churchill. But Churchill faced a dilemma. If Germany attacked Britain, Japan might exploit the situation by assaulting Singapore. As a result, he reluctantly continued a policy of Far East appeasement. When Japan mined China's coastal ports to cut off foreign aid and demanded Britain close the Burma Road, Churchill complied. This marked the fading remnants of appeasement diplomacy. Across the Atlantic, America was deep in a presidential election. Roosevelt, campaigning for re-election, repeatedly assured voters the U.S. would remain neutral, understanding most Americans wanted to stay out of a distant war. Privately, however, FDR recognized Japan's aggressive expansionism. He quietly approved $100 million in aid and 50 fighter planes for China, critical support for its struggling air force and war effort. While already supplying Britain with war materials, the U.S. American weapons shipped from East Coast ports crossed the Pacific and were unloaded in Rangoon before being trucked along the Burma Road to Kunming, Chongqing, and Chinese military units. Protecting this vital supply route became urgent, but with China's air force weakened and America not yet at war with Japan, direct U.S. military involvement wasn't an option. In June 1941, the U.S. government authorized reserve pilots to volunteer for service in China. Retired Air Force officer Claire Chennault assembled over 100 volunteers into the American Volunteer Group, a VG tasked with defending the Burma Road. Their fighters, famously painted with shark mouths, became iconic, and pilots earned $500 for each Japanese plane shot down. Known as the Flying Tigers, this unit would soon make history. On July 26, 1941, Japanese naval forces began utilizing Cam Ranh Bay in southern Vietnam as a base, directly threatening the South Pacific Islands. In response, President Roosevelt swiftly ordered the freezing of Japanese assets in the United States and imposed trade restrictions between the two nations. This decisive move severely impacted Japan's military-industrial production, as the resource-poor nation relied entirely on imports, particularly American oil and scrap metal, to fuel its war machine. Contemporary American commentators warned this economic pressure might force Japan into desperate action, a prediction that would prove tragically accurate. Facing critical shortages, Japan accelerated its southern expansion doctrine to seize oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Malaya, though hesitated knowing this meant war with Allied powers. While America only halted high-octane aviation fuel exports, continuing other oil shipments, Japan perceived this as tantamount to a declaration of war. In this petroleum-starved nation, grounded warplanes idled at airfields while bored pilots killed time chatting. The Imperial Navy, consuming the most fuel, calculated its fleet would become inoperable within a year under full embargo. Japan found itself trapped between maintaining its China campaign without adequate resources or risking war with Western powers by expanding southward. Amid this crisis, hardline Kwantung Army leader Hideki Tojo replaced the more moderate leadership, becoming Prime Minister and War Minister. Tojo aggressively pushed for southern expansion regardless of consequences, believing a preemptive strike could neutralize American Pacific forces, allowing Japan free rein in Southeast Asia. In November 1941, Japan dispatched German Ambassador Eugen Ott, whose American wife and fluent English made him an ideal envoy to negotiate lifting the embargo. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, distrustful of Ott's meticulously groomed appearance, demanded Japan's complete withdrawal from China, relinquishment of extraterritorial rights, and abandonment of its Axis alliance as preconditions. Tojo erupted upon receiving these terms, viewing them as an unacceptable ultimatum. With Japan unwilling to abandon its imperial ambitions, the path to Pacific War became inevitable. The Japanese army had long prepared amphibious operations in terrain mimicking Southeast Asia's swamps and waterways. By late autumn 1941, Japan's military forces stood poised like arrows ready to fly. For Japan to declare war on the United States required the emperor's approval. During the crucial imperial conference, Emperor Hirohito recited 2 lines of poetry written by his father, Emperor Meiji. "All the seas in every direction are brothers. Why then do the winds and waves clash so violently?" This subtle expression hinted at his disapproval of the Southern expansion policy. Nevertheless, Japanese military leaders aggressively advanced their plans to push southward, targeting British-held Singapore and Malaya, American-controlled Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, and critically the Burma Road supply route entering at Rangoon, Burma's British-controlled capital. To counter Japan's expansion, Roosevelt and Churchill coordinated their response. Britain dispatched a powerful naval force led by the HMS Prince of Wales from Europe to Singapore, while America relocated its Pacific Fleet to Hawaii under the guise of training exercises, hoping to deter Japanese ambition. Western military strategists believed these deployments would effectively block Japan's naval advance in Southeast Asia. Then came an unexpected development: 2 separate attacks on U.S. ships by German submarines in the Atlantic. Roosevelt capitalized on public outrage by screening footage of the attacks in theaters nationwide. With grim determination, he announced that U.S. Navy ships would now fire upon any encountered German vessels, bringing America to the brink of war with Germany. This show of resolve also served as a warning to Japan. Roosevelt further ordered the Hawaiian-based fleet to remain stationed there permanently. With Britain's Prince of Wales task force now in Singapore, the Allies had Japan in a strategic pincer movement. On November 27, 1941, Japanese envoy Kichisaburo Nomura met with Roosevelt at the White House, again demanding an end to U.S. sanctions. Roosevelt warned bluntly that Japan's fascist policies would lead to defeat. After the meeting, the president confided to aides that war could erupt within days. The next day, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts decoded Japanese messages indicating imminent military action. While American officials assumed Singapore would be Japan's primary target, Roosevelt vowed that any Japanese attack on British holdings would trigger American intervention. This reflected his conviction that Japan would strike Allied colonies first. However, Japanese strategists had a different calculus. Their war plans prioritized crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet first, which would allow them to sweep through Southeast Asia unopposed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, masterminded a surprise attack plan against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese combined fleet departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands with 6 aircraft carriers carrying 354 planes, protected by an extensive escort fleet, sailing into the turbulent Pacific waters toward their target Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. As the main base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Pearl Harbor had been identified in a U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff report as a potential target for Japanese carrier-based attacks, though these warnings went unheeded. American military leaders significantly underestimated Japan's capabilities, believing the Imperial Navy could only provide limited naval support in southern operations and lacked the capacity for long-range carrier strikes. Yet the Japanese were indeed coming. Aboard the flagship, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo addressed his crew, "Our target is Pearl Harbor. The fate of the empire depends on this operation. Every man must do his duty." On Saturday, December 6, Japanese Ambassador Nomura urgently requested a 1:00 p.m. meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who arrived early at his office awaiting the ambassador. After the scheduled time passed, the Japanese embassy requested a slight postponement. Meanwhile, Japanese reconnaissance planes scouting Pearl Harbor reported no unusual activity. Due to the international dateline, it was already early Sunday morning, December 7 in Hawaii, when the Japanese strike force turned into the wind 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor to launch aircraft. Hundreds of engines roared as pilots, having left behind fingernail clippings and hair and farewell letters and tied on traditional senbari good luck belts, boarded their planes. Aircraft launched one after another from the rolling decks, with the first wave of 183 planes, 49 Type 99 bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo planes, and 43 Zero fighters, forming up and heading south toward Pearl Harbor as dawn's first light reflected off their wings. 1 hour later, the second wave of 167 aircraft launched. En route, Japanese pilots ironically listened to Hawaiian music broadcasts on their radios, while the U.S. Navy remained completely unaware of the approaching danger. That peaceful Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor was shattered at 7:55 a.m. when the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft began their assault. The attackers first bombed nearby naval airfields to establish air superiority before launching torpedo runs against the ships anchored in the harbor. Among the 86 American vessels moored at Pearl Harbor that day were 8 battleships, 7 cruisers, 20 destroyers, and 5 submarines. Sailors just waking up initially mistook the approaching aircraft for routine drills until bombs, torpedoes, and machine gun fire rained down upon them. Within moments, the harbor erupted in flames and thick smoke as explosions and alarm sirens filled the air. The Ford Island radio station urgently broadcast, "Pearl Harbor is under attack. This is not a drill." Caught completely unprepared, American forces could only mount scattered anti-aircraft fire in the opening minutes. Though about 24 U.S. fighters managed to scramble, their disorganized response led to many being shot down by Japanese Zeros, or even accidentally hit by friendly fire. After 45 minutes of devastation, the first wave withdrew as the second wave of 167 planes arrived to continue the assault for another hour. When the attack finally ended, the Japanese had sunk or damaged over 40 ships, including 5 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 2 destroyers sunk, with 3 more battleships, 3 cruisers, and 5 auxiliary vessels damaged. The Americans lost 260 aircraft and suffered over 4,500 casualties, while the Japanese lost just 29 planes. Ironically, the primary target's 3 U.S. aircraft carriers were away from port that day, though the Pacific Fleet had been effectively crippled regardless. News of the surprise attack reached Washington quickly, with the White House being first to learn. President Roosevelt, maintaining remarkable composure, instructed Secretary of State Cordell Hull to remain outwardly calm when meeting with the Japanese diplomats. At 2:20 p.m. Ambassador Nomura finally arrived to deliver Japan's declaration of war over an hour after the attack began. Hull famously told the diplomats, "In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions." Meanwhile, White House correspondents quickly spread the shocking news nationwide and worldwide. Simultaneously, Japanese embassy staff were burning so many documents that smoke drew the local fire department, who initially thought the building was on fire. By 4 p.m., Roosevelt convened an emergency cabinet meeting that lasted into the night, uniting previously divided political factions as America prepared to enter what would become its greatest war. Some observers noted General Marshall's strangely composed demeanor, fueling post-war conspiracy theories that Pearl Harbor had been a deliberate sacrifice to overcome American isolationism speculation that persisted for decades after the war ended. The next morning, Washington stood in eerie silence as crowds gathered behind police barricades outside the Capitol building. At noon, President Roosevelt arrived to deliver a historic 10-minute address, declaring December 7, 1941 a date, which will live in infamy as he described Japan's premeditated naval attack. Requesting Congress to formally recognize a state of war, Roosevelt confidently assured the nation of America's unwavering determination to achieve ultimate victory. Air raid sirens soon wailed across American cities, signaling the abrupt arrival of war in the Pacific. The bombs at Pearl Harbor had shattered isolationist sentiments and awakened the sleeping industrial giant. From that moment, America committed to 4 grueling years of Pacific warfare. Capitalizing on their surprise attack advantage, Japanese forces launched coordinated assaults across Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma within hours of Pearl Harbor. Britain's last hope for defending Southeast Asia rested with the Far Eastern Fleet, led by the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, tasked with intercepting Japanese troop transports. As the British warships patrolled Malaysian waters near Kuantan on December 10, Japanese reconnaissance planes spotted them, soon followed by swarming bombers and torpedo planes that attacked like wolves surrounding their prey. By midday, HMS Repulse had sunk, followed an hour later by the crippled Prince of Wales, taking 840 Royal Navy sailors down, while survivors were rescued to Singapore. With only 3 aircraft lost, Japan had virtually annihilated Britain's Southeast Asian fleet, exposing Singapore's vulnerable defenses. The strategically vital naval hub at the southern tip of Malaya, fortified over decades as Britain's key Asian base, now faced relentless Japanese bombing raids. Despite its 100,000-strong garrison of Indian, Australian, and Malay troops, Singapore's fatal flaw became apparent: its coastal guns pointed seaward, while landward defenses remained inadequate, a critical oversight the Japanese would ruthlessly exploit. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed in Thailand and quickly advanced into Malaya. In a stunning display of mobility, 70,000 Japanese troops rode bicycles, weaving through dense jungles and smashing through British Indian defenses as they pushed toward Singapore hundreds of miles away. Some WWI historians have dubbed this the bicycle blitzkrieg. Only then did the British realize Japan wouldn't attack Singapore by sea instead. They were striking from the land, targeting its weakest point. The Japanese forces, led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, later known as the Tiger of Malaya, fought their way through the mountainous, river-cut terrain of the Malay Peninsula like a storm sweeping across the tropical wilderness. Artillery duels erupted between Japanese mountain guns and British field batteries, with both sides constantly shifting positions in brutal, fast-moving combat. Yamashita's troops covered the length of the peninsula in just 7 weeks, reaching the southern tip opposite Singapore with fewer than 2,000 casualties. Meanwhile, the British Commonwealth defenders in Singapore, nearly 140,000 strong, outnumbering the Japanese 2-to-1, lacked both tanks and air superiority. Japanese bombers pounded their positions unchecked. In early February 1942, the Japanese exploited low tides to cross the Johor Strait and storm Singapore itself. Once they seized the city's water supply, the demoralized Commonwealth forces surrendered. The fall of Singapore was catastrophic. While Japanese losses numbered under 10,000, over 100,000 Allied troops and civilians perished, and 130,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, the largest capitulation in British military history. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the garrison commander, became the first British general captured in WWII. The Japanese offensive continued relentlessly. Manila fell next, followed by the surrender of 70,000 American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula on April 9. By May, Corregidor's defenders had also capitulated, completing Japan's conquest of the Philippines. Simultaneously, Japan invaded Burma from Thailand in January 1942. 2 divisions struck south toward Moulmein. The British defenders, mostly Indian, Burmese, and famed Gurkha troops, had assumed Japan wouldn't waste resources on Burma. But Chiang Kai-shek's government recognized the danger. Rangoon was the lifeline for us. Arms shipments to China. Despite Chiang's pleas for 3 British armies to secure the Burma Road, London delayed until Japanese forces crossed the Salween River, threatening Rangoon. By the time hastily dispatched Chinese reinforcements arrived, it was too late. Trapped and outmaneuvered, Allied resistance collapsed so completely that Japanese troops waded across the Salween unopposed. In March 1942, Japanese forces captured Rangoon, cutting off access to the Burma Road and completely severing China's last supply line of foreign aid. With this victory following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan successfully achieved its southern expansion doctrine, not only securing vital resources, but also establishing dominance over the Pacific. For America, a relatively young nation where many global events were being experienced for the first time, Pearl Harbor represented an unprecedented national humiliation. As Japanese forces continued pushing Allied troops off islands across the Pacific, Americans faced their darkest hour since becoming a world power. In this moment of crisis, angry Americans did something contrary to their national traditions. They took out their fury on Japanese immigrants. Since the early 20th century, Japanese immigrants had been settling in America despite the 1920s immigration bans targeting Asians. When war broke out, these immigrant communities became easy targets. The U.S. government, operating on suspicion rather than evidence, forcibly relocated West Coast Japanese Americans to inland internment camps surrounded by barbed wire. While not comparable to Nazi concentration camps, these facilities nevertheless represented a shameful violation of civil liberties that did little to satisfy America's thirst for vengeance. What Americans truly wanted was retaliation to see American bombers appear over Tokyo one morning and repay Japan in kind for Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt had been pressing military leaders for exactly such a strike, believing nothing would restore morale better than bombing Japan's capital. The challenge was immense. Even America's longest-range bombers couldn't reach Japan from Hawaii and return. It wasn't until January 1942 that Admiral King proposed an audacious solution, launching Army bombers from an aircraft carrier. After careful evaluation, the B-25 Mitchell bomber was selected for this one-way mission to Tokyo, after which crews would continue to China. Led by record-setting pilot Jimmy Doolittle, 24 modified B-25s, stripped of defensive guns to add fuel capacity, and their crews spent a month practicing the unprecedented feat of launching heavy bombers from a carrier deck. This daring plan would become America's first direct strike against the Japanese homeland. The B-25 bombers of Doolittle's raiders were carefully loaded onto the USS Hornet. Since these land-based bombers couldn't fold their wings for below-deck storage, they had to be lined up on the flight deck, limiting the capacity to just 16 aircraft. The next day, the newly commissioned Hornet set sail carrying these bombers and their crews, escorted by a heavy cruiser and 5 light cruisers, heading toward Japanese waters. For 15 days, the task force navigated carefully across the Pacific. The original plan called for launch about 500 nautical miles east of Japan on the afternoon of April 18. However, early that morning at approximately 700 nautical miles out, the Japanese patrol boat Nit-2 Maru spotted the American fleet. Though quickly sunk by U.S. forces, it had already transmitted an alert. Japanese coastal defenses now knew an American fleet was approaching, though the nearest Japanese naval units remained 700 miles away, too distant to threaten an immediate attack. This unexpected development created a critical dilemma. If the Japanese had time to prepare, the Tokyo raid would lose its element of surprise and face heavy fighter opposition. Photographers captured Colonel Doolittle pacing anxiously on deck as he weighed the options. The original night attack plan was now impossible. Any launch would occur in daylight, exposing the bombers to intense anti-aircraft fire. Worse, the early launch point meant the planes wouldn't have enough fuel to reach the planned landing site at Nanchang, China. Facing these challenges, Doolittle's crew demonstrated extraordinary courage. Putting mission success above personal safety, they unanimously voted to launch immediately. "Okay, boys," Doolittle finally said, "let's go do it." At 7:25 p.m., the first B-25 roared off the deck, beginning a staggered departure that took nearly an hour. By 8:24 p.m., all 16 aircraft were airborne. With fuel critically limited, they flew individually toward Tokyo rather than forming up as a group. This premature launch from 668 nautical miles out 168 miles farther than planned meant none could reach friendly Chinese territory, forcing them to bail out or crash land in Japanese-occupied areas of northern and eastern China, with all the dangers that entailed. As American planes approached Tokyo's airspace, the city was conducting an air defense drill. To make the exercise more realistic, the Japanese used their own aircraft to simulate enemy planes flying over Tokyo. While curious civilians gazed skyward, drill participants solemnly set off smoke bombs to create the illusion of bombing explosions filling the air with smoke. School children laughingly rushed from classrooms to air raid shelters as civil defense personnel wearing gas masks shouted warnings about incoming aircraft. Volunteer fire brigades practiced extinguishing deliberately set fires when suddenly real American bombers appeared. Tokyo came under actual attack, marking Japan's first homeland bombing since Pearl Harbor. Citizens only realized the danger when real bombs began falling, stunned by this thunderbolt from clear skies. Because Doolittle's raiders had launched separately, their staggered arrival from multiple directions completely confused Japanese defenses about the number of attacking planes. The weekend timing meant crowded streets as hundreds of buildings erupted in flames, sending panicked civilians scrambling through chaotic streets. After successfully bombing Tokyo, Doolittle's squadron flew toward China. With fuel exhausted, all 16 crews either bailed out or crash-landed along China's Zhejiang coast. Fortunately, most American airmen received immediate help from local civilians, some escorted through enemy lines to nationalist forces, others delivered to communist guerrillas who transferred them to Yan'an. After a year's journey, survivors reunited in Chongqing where Chinese authorities transferred them to General Stilwell. Of the 80 airmen, 8 were captured by Japanese forces and brought to Tokyo under armed guard. A Japanese military tribunal sentenced 2 to immediate execution by firing squad. 1 died in prison, while the remaining 5 endured captivity until war's end. News of Tokyo's bombing shocked Japan, with citizens bewildered how American planes could reach their capital. When questioned, President Roosevelt mysteriously claimed they came from Shangri-La. This audacious raid cast a psychological shadow over Japan, proving the war could now reach their homeland at any moment. Following the bombing of Tokyo, Japanese Navy Commander-in-Chief Isoroku Yamamoto felt profound personal responsibility, repeatedly apologizing to the emperor while still agonizing over how his failures had brought such disaster to Japan. Determined to redeem himself, he resolved to commit Japan's naval forces to a decisive battle with the Americans, a decision that would ultimately lead to a series of catastrophic mistakes in the Pacific theater. After the Doolittle raid, Japanese high command prioritized capturing mid-Pacific islands, adopting simultaneous eastern and southern advance strategies. The eastern push targeted Midway Island to create a defensive perimeter around Japan while establishing a staging area for potential attacks on the U.S. mainland, while the southern advance aimed to control the Solomon Islands and Coral Sea regions as stepping stones toward Australia. On April 17, having broken Japanese codes, U.S. intelligence intercepted messages revealing plans to attack Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea. For this operation, Japan deployed a massive fleet including 3 aircraft carriers, 10 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 3 gunboats, and 12 transports. With detailed knowledge of Japanese movements, Admiral Nimitz boldly consolidated scattered U.S. Pacific forces totaling 26 ships including 2 carriers, 8 cruisers, 13 destroyers, 1 supply ship, and 2 transports, rushing them to the Solomons area to confront a Japanese force of roughly equivalent strength. At 9:00 a.m. on May 6, the Japanese fleet sailing 180 nautical miles west of Tulagi received scout plane reports of a large American carrier group within 420 nautical miles. The Japanese commander immediately dispatched carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku with 2 destroyers southward to engage in what would become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea, named for the 480 square kilometer azure waters dotted with tropical islands northeast of Australia. For 2 days, the opposing fleets searched unsuccessfully for each other across this vast area, even as Japanese troops successfully landed on and occupied Tulagi Island, due east of New Guinea, completing the first phase of their Port Moresby operation. As the Japanese invasion fleet steamed toward Port Moresby, American forces raced to intercept them, culminating in the opposing fleets finally detecting each other almost simultaneously in the early hours of May 7. The American fleet was navigating at 1320s, 154-21s, moving northwest to intercept the Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby through the Jomard Passage. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet positioned at 1010s, 152-27A, was conducting southeastward searches to prevent the American forces from approaching their transport ships. Both sides sounded battle alarms almost simultaneously, though separated by 163 nautical miles, too distant for visual contact or naval gunfire, making carrier-based aircraft the only viable weapon. Thus began history's first carrier versus carrier naval battle on that fateful day. American strike groups immediately launched 93 aircraft that braved intense anti-aircraft fire to concentrate their attack on the light carrier Sh. Despite the Japanese carrier turning into the wind to launch its planes, relentless American assaults prevented any aircraft from taking off. The Sh absorbed 13 direct bomb hits and 7 torpedoes, sinking with over 600 crew members. Simultaneously, Japanese carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku had launched 78 aircraft targeting what reconnaissance reported as an American carrier group. After 2 frustrating hours of fruitless searching, the Japanese pilots discovered their actual targets were the oiler USS Neosho and destroyer USS Sims. In furious frustration, the Japanese aircraft unleashed their full payloads. The Sims took 3 250 kg bomb hits, 2 detonating in the engine room, while the Neosho suffered 7 direct hits, but miraculously allowed 123 crew members to escape before sinking. 3 minutes later, as night fell, both fleets exercised caution, having confirmed each other's proximity during May 7's engagements. At dawn on May 8th, the Japanese launched 7 reconnaissance planes while the Americans sent 8. At 6:22 a.m., American scouts spotted the Japanese carriers, followed just 8 minutes later by Japanese aircraft, locating the American fleet, triggering another simultaneous battle alert. The USS Yorktown launched 39 aircraft, while the Lexington sent up 43, combining for an 82-plane strike force heading toward the enemy fleet.